You didn't dream of this life. No little boy in the medieval marketplace looked up at the village gallows and thought, that'll be me one day. And yet, here you are, an apprentice to the local torturer, a man with more missing teeth than usable fingers, who smells like grease, dried blood, and something bitterly metallic. Your name doesn't matter much to people anymore. Once, it might have been Tom the Tanner's boy or Martin from the lower field. But since your master took you under his wing, your name became a whisper behind cupped hands. A space cleared around you in the tavern. Conversations halted when you walked past. You'd become something else, not quite a sinner, but not clean enough for a blessing. You didn't earn parades or poems. You were paid in coins, meat scraps, and protection from the law. The town council made sure no one hurt you, but they also made sure no one grew too close, or something darker, a numbness that made it easier to keep doing what others couldn't. You tried to delay, to urge the priest to reconsider, but orders came from higher up. You didn't touch him directly, but you saw it for what it was. Nothing more than a survival tactic from a child who learned how cheaply the truth could be bought. You were told only to frighten him, to lay out the tools, and to let him hear the screams of a prisoner in the next room. You started to wonder how many of the confessions you'd helped extract were real. But Godric found you staring at the fire and said, "It's worse when you care. But it's better for them that you do." How many were just words pulled from terror and desperation? But when he sobbed and begged and confessed to something you knew he didn't do, something cracked inside you. You were needed but not liked, respected but only in the way people respect storms and disease. It wasn't that they thought you were cruel. It was that they didn't want to imagine what your hands had done. You're no criminal, but you're no longer quite clean either. You were brought into this line of work like many others in your shoes through desperation. The pear, the rack, the thumbscrews, each had its rhythm. You became good at reading face, seeing when someone was about to break, lie, or faint. You could spot fear like a hunter spots tracks in snow, and that made you valuable. Your father died of a festering wound after a barley harvest accident, and your mother couldn't feed the family. You were 10. You oiled the joints of the Iron Maiden, even though it was more for show than use. You hauled firewood to heat the branding irons, emptied the bloody slop from the floor trench, and scrubbed stains from the walls that never truly disappeared. But soon, you learned more than you ever thought you would about joints, tendons, and the ways the human body could be convinced to confess. The town needed someone to help Master Godric, whose back bent too far, and whose hands trembled when he held his tools. He spoke of pressure points and timing, of knowing when to back off, when to wait, and when to press. He insisted that his job wasn't to inflict pain, but to extract truth. What good is a scream if it leads you nowhere? He once muttered, pouring vinegar into a man's nail bed. But deep down, you knew many of the men and women brought before you never had much truth to offer. They just didn't want to hang out. No one wanted the job. So, after 2 days of not eating, you took it. At first, your duties were menial. You cleaned the rack. Master Godric wasn't cruel. Not exactly, he said. Torture was an art. You began to notice little things. People stopped meeting your eyes. Children wouldn't play near your home. Women avoided your gaze at the market. There was no glamour in the work, no swagger. Torturers weren't knights or warriors. Still, you learned. But late at night, when the tools were silent and the coals cold, you wondered what had really made you choose this. Was it hunger? Obligation? And then came the boy, 12 years old, accused of stealing a relic from the church, a ridiculous charge. But the bishop insisted. He was too young, too small. You watched Godric nod in satisfaction. A clean confession, he said. That night, you didn't sleep. The tools seemed heavier. Your hands wouldn't stop shaking. And what did that make you? The next morning, you thought of leaving, disappearing into the woods, becoming a charcoal burner or wandering monk. You didn't know what he meant then. Maybe you still don't, but it lingers in your mind, like the iron smell of the chamber, like the silent faces of those who pass your home and cross themselves when they think you don TC. Were you truly the villain, or just a man doing the only job left to him in a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford. You carried the weight of your profession quietly. The job didn't offer room for pride or comfort, only a careful distance from others and an understanding that you were useful as long as you stayed in your place. Over the years, you became known not for cruelty, but for consistency. You were thorough, efficient, unemotional, but that was a mask you wore for survival. Master Godric died during a harsh winter, slipping on an icy stair while walking home from the tavern. His death came with little ceremony. No priest agreed to bless his grave. No widow mourned him. Only you stood by as the gravedigger shoveled frozen earth onto the coffin. And then, just like that, you inherited the tools. You even cleaned and sharpened your tools with a kind of reverence, less for what they did and more for what you hoped they might prevent. A clean blade hurts less. A fast break healed better, enough to forget the sounds of breaking cartilage and whimpering. You found comfort in small rituals, boiling your gloves, folding claws neatly, reciting prayers under your breath before each session. Not because you believed they made a difference, but because routines gave you something to hold on to. Somewhere in your mind, a part of you still believed that maybe, if you were careful enough, you could do this job without becoming a monster. You read quietly by candlelight, your fingers still stained from work. You wrote in a small journal, chronicling thoughts you'd never dare speak aloud. Someone had a dislocated shoulder. A child swallowed a nail. An old man broke his leg. They came not because they trusted you, but because you knew anatomy. You could reset bones. You could stitch. You even saved a boy once who'd been mauled by a boar, though his mother never thanked you directly. So one day, you asked if she'd join you for a walk. She hesitated, then smiled. The court heard the confession. The family paid. Everyone left satisfied. What twisted them into instruments of agony was the intention behind them. Not faces, not voices, reaching, trembling. Maybe you were afraid to find out who you were without the job. Or maybe, like a cracked pot patched over and over, you simply kept holding your shape because there was nothing else left. Clawing at the ropes, twitching when bones shifted under pressure. You woke up sweating, and as much as you tried to believe you were different, more careful, more ethical, the outcomes were often the same. I think it is better if you stay where people can TC you with me, she said, not unkindly. How many times had it been for show? And did it even matter? The bishop died, replaced by one with softer robes and sharper eyes. But your place stayed the same. You were still the torturer. Still the shadow that walked by, unnoticed. Still the man who had to knock twice on the back door of the tavern to be served, and never got invited to weddings or funerals. I still have to sell things. She left a loaf of bread on your doorstep. That was all. For all the disgust people showed, the position meant stability. And sometimes, even you didn't know whether a confession was real or the product of someone desperate to make the pain stop. A nobleman's son had been accused of conspiring with thieves, and the sheriff demanded a confession. The boy was soft-handed, pale, barely more than a teenager. His father paid to have the torture simulated rather than inflicted. No blood, just the illusion of it. You were ordered to perform the session like a play. You bound him gently, showed him the tools, and whispered that if he screamed convincingly, it would be over quickly. There was a woman, Alice, who sold dried herbs and tinctures at the market. She spoke to you kindly, without flinching. You bought peppermint leaves from her for your headaches, and once shared a laugh about a chicken that followed her to the well. She had a soft way of speaking, like she wasn't afraid of silence. Some, especially those with something to hide, even showed you a warped form of deference. After all, you knew things. You'd heard the secrets of nobles and clergy alike, pulled from ragged throats in the echoing dark. What you carried wasn't just blood on your hands but knowledge. You had your house, small and cold, but yours, a reliable wage, legal protection. If someone insulted you, the bailiff had your back. You weren't exactly part of the town, but you were tethered to it like a barnacle to a hull. Not welcomed, but needed. The council appointed you. Officially, you were no longer the apprentice. You were the torturer now. At first, there was a strange pride in the appointment. And there were perks. Criminals avoided your street. People let you pass in lines. You tried to set rules. You refused to work with children. You requested written orders for every session. But time wore you down. The faces blurred. The pleas sounded the same. You started drinking more. Not heavily, but often. Enough to sleep. Your house became a quiet place. You filled it with books when you could afford them, texts on anatomy, medicine, even philosophy. Pain, you once wrote, is a language, and we've made ourselves fluent. Occasionally, townsfolk came to you for advice not about justice, but about and still, no one called Yaou a friend. You tried. Once, you thought maybe, just maybe you could talk to her more. And just like that, the idea dissolved. You didn't blame her. There was a moment that stayed with you. He did, but you sat there afterward, staring at the tools and wondering how long you'd been part of a performance. How many times had the pain been real? The tools weren't evil. You'd come to understand that they were just iron and wood things people made. You began dreaming of hands. The town changed over the years. The council rotated. Laws shifted. And yet, through it all, you stayed. Maybe you believed you were preventing worse cruelty. But sometimes, in the quiet of your workshop, when the fire burned low and the tools lay clean, unused, and waiting, you wondered, had the town changed? Or had you? Years passed, and with them, your face aged in the mirror like a wax figure left too close to the fire creased, sagging, tired. Confessions mattered less when witnesses were plenty and coin could buy silence. You weren't being pushed out. Not exactly. But you knew. The world was moving past you. Your voice had become like your hands measured, quiet, and scarred by use. She was accused of poisoning a nobleman's wine. The evidence was circumstantial. The noble had died at his own feast. The cook confessed nothing. But the lady had argued with him 2 nights before, and that was enough. When the sessions came, you performed your role without passion, without hesitation. But afterward, it took longer to clean the tools, longer to sleep. She just looked at you over and over, like she was taking you apart with her eyes. The bishop had ordered a written confession before the week's end. But you didn't move. Your hands hovered. You looked at the tools, then at her, as if she were the one learning how pain works. You'd sit in your little room above the chamber, staring at the candle stub, listening to the tick of cooling metal. They found her 2 days later, face down in the river. Whether she slipped, jumped, or was helped along, no one could say. You kept the journal by your side. Sometimes you wrote, often you didn't. More modern, clean with it. A new enforcer was brought in, a younger man, eager and talkative. He had new tools and newer methods. Psychological pressure, they called it. Modern interrogation. He didn't use racks or irons. He used isolation, threats, and silence. Your fingers, once steady and surgical, grew knotted and stiff with cold. They accepted your word, but with a warning. Don't get soft, old man. Mercy isn't your job. But they didn't dismiss you. Not yet. You were punished in subtler ways. Payments delayed. Orders barked instead of spoken. Rumors circulated. A bailiff who once called your name in a dim chamber. You offered him a better knot. One you'd learned long ago. Not for birds, but for binding limbs. He copied it, grinning. They nodded at you with a look that wasn't quite respect. Not quite fear, something in between. The townspeople began to whisper louder now, emboldened by the cracks in your reputation. I was just someone who did what needed doing. A rebel hiding names. You were the last resort. Not the first line, but the final hammer. The one they hoped not to use but did. You reached into the cloth-wrapped box and pulled out an old iron Kia tool for unlocking finger stocks. Smooth with age, cold in your palm. You found yourself taking longer to light the hearth, forgetting where you'd set down your tools. You kept 1 or 2 in a box, wrapped in cloth, not because you needed them, but because part of you didn't know how to let go. You burned the journal. It felt necessary, like shedding skin. You didn't complain. You didn't expect anyone to care. "Do you believe in what you do?" she asked, voice low. Even you didn't answer. You never did. Questions invited guilt, and you're left with your thoughts and the weight of hands that never quite come clean. And guilt rusted the gears of your trade. Your house smelled of vinegar and old leather. The town still needed you, but less often. Torture had grown, unfashionable. Trials had changed. Still, they came, not as often but always, when something truly ugly happened. A noble's secret scandal, a heretic, unwilling to confess. You learned to speak little. One winter, a cart arrived, bearing a prisoner, unlike the others, a woman, late middle-aged, wiry, and alert, with a face that didn't plead. The council demanded a confession. You were called from Samir. As you laid out the tools methodical, ceremonial, she watched you calmly. But this one, ... She was different. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. You were supposed to break her fingers. The notary sat, ready, with ink and parchment. You stepped away. You told them she passed out. That she was unfit to continue. That the winter chill had made her delirious. And yet, something cracked in you that day. You left the chamber door, unlocked that night. Whether it was an accident or a choice, you still don't know. She escaped. The council blamed you. Quietly, discreetly, still, you stayed. What else could you do? Years later, the town built a new jailhouse. The council sent you a letter. Your services are no longer required, though your past contributions are appreciated. It was unsigned. They gave you a small stipend, enough to live barely. You sold your tools, most of them anyway. People began to forget. New generations arrived. To them, you were just an old man on the edge of town. You grew vegetables. You rarely spoke. And yet, sometimes, a traveler passed through who recognized you. A merchant who remembered his cousin's trial. One evening, while walking near the woods, you came across a Boyton, maybe 11 trapping birds with a crude snare. He looked up, surprised. "You used to be someone important," he asked, not unkindly. You paused. The wind rustled the branches. "No," you said. The boy nodded, then ran off, leaving you alone in the fading light. That night, you sat by the hearth. The flames flickered low. You wondered, had you helped justice or just greased the gears of fear? Would history remember you as a man of purpose or as a ghost in the records? Unnamed, unmissed, and more hauntingly, did it matter? Because what lingers longest in your memory isn't the screams or the pain. It's the silence after, that deep, aching silence. Once the confession is signed, the door swings closed. You wake before dawn. As always, the air is still cool, thick with dew, and the stones beneath your feet are slick. As you make your way toward the Colosseum, the streets are mostly empty, save for a few beggars curling deeper into doorways and vendors, dragging carts of boiled beans and wine-soaked bread into position. But your path is different. You're not a vendor. You're not even a citizen. Technically, you're an executor, mortis and executioner. Inside, the hum of preparation is already building beastmasters leading half-starved lions into their holding pens, carpenters hammering together props for the Moxie battle, and slaves scrubbing dried blood from the sand where yesterday's show ended in The sand drinks it up. Someone had to do it. The state has given you a role most wouldn't even whisper about. You avoided unnecessary pain. And today is a spectacle day. You were giving Rome what it wanted: order, fear, and justice. Better a former soldier than some untrained butcher. You knew where to cut, how to make it quick. Your name isn't shouted like the gladiators. You don't receive wreaths or wine or the approving gaze of the emperor. No one writes songs about you. The curved blade, the chain spike in case one runs. The guards nod, opening the iron gate. It's all routine now. Accused of blasphemy, conspiracy, and sedition. You don't know whether they're guilty. You stopped asking years ago, but you play your part in the theater of Rome they part. People pretend not to watch too closely. Your chains are heavier than ours, though their eyes never leave your hands once you step into the arena. Not the gladiators, they have their own quarters, full of camaraderie and performance. Bravado. No, the prisoners here are not trained fighters. All Christians. Their fate was sealed long before you stepped into the room. The bindings, the iron collar, but your stomach is tight. By the time you arrive at the Colosseum's service entrance, the sun is peeking over the city walls. But the woman, she simply says, do what you must. Not because they're hard to handle, but because they linger in your thoughts. That's the worst kind. They will be bound and paraded into the arena after the second act after the mock naval battle, but before the tiger fight. You tell them how it will go. Quick, if they cooperate. Painful. If not, there is no mercy, only efficiency. You head to the spoliarium, a low, vaulted room that smells of iron and rot. They patched you up with an iron brace and sent you home. Half a man and half a burden. There weren't many paths forward, but your hands were still strong. You understood discipline. You didn't flinch. So when a senator you once served under offered you the job quietly, without ceremony, you took it. This is where the condemned wait. There are thieves, traitors, rebels, runaway slaves, and Christians, men and women the crowd will not mourn. Except sometimes they do, and that's what haunts you. You've been doing this job for years. You were once a soldier, lost a leg in Germania. At first, you told yourself it was better this way, but the crowd didn't want quick. They wanted spectacle. Today's sentence involves 3 condemned prisoners, 2 men and a woman. You visit them in their cell. The woman meets your eyes. She's calm, almost too calm. You explain the order. The odor of the men spits at you. You don't react. It happens often. You'll leave the cell more rattled than you'd like to admit. Back in the preparation room, you ready the tools. Not because of them, because of the crowd. They are the unpredictable ones. The citizens of Rome, drunk on wine and rage, can turn the mood of the games with a single roar. You've seen it before. You've seen crowds demand cruelty when you offered mercy. You've seen them cheer when a man's intestines spilled from his belly. You've seen them boo when a clean stroke ended a life too fast. They don't care about justice. They want blood. They want drama. And if you don't give it to them, you become the show. Years ago, a colleague of yours, a man named Flaccus, was jeered for letting a thief die too quickly. The man had refused to scream even as the blade fell. The crowd turned ugly, accused Flaccus of being weak. By week's end, he was reassigned to the mine. He lasted less than a month. So today, you must walk a line. Not too cruel, not too merciful. Performative brutality enough to satisfy. Not so much that it invites backlash. It's an art, really, a terrible one. The roar of the crowd is like the sea. It drowns thought. A chant you can't make out at first. Then you hear it. Punir, punish them. You stand in the shadows near the entrance gate, watching as the second act ends with a staged drowning. The anticipation curdling into disapproval. Slaves dressed as pirates sink in a false ship, waving dramatically before slipping under dyed water. You hesitate. By mid-morning, the stands are packed. Senators in silk, merchants with wives and children with sticky fingers. Then comes your cue. The gatekeeper gestures. You enter the arena. No speeches, just the rhythm of state power on display. The light blinds you momentarily. The sand crunches under your boots. The crowd cheers. Some chanting. She's whispering. A prayer. Maybe. The prisoners are dragged out behind you. Shackled. Robed. Barefoot. They don't resist. The woman looks up at the sky. Some begin to shout. The guards reach for her arms. But you hold up a hand. She stares at you. There's no fear. Only resolve. You take your position. The execution is simple. A beat, one by one. A clean blade. But the crowd doesn't want simplicity. They boo when the first man is laid down. They want a delay. They want drama. They want him to beg. You feel it, building the unrest. The condemned man closes his eyes. You raise the blade. The crowd begins to hiss. You swing. It's clean, efficient, but quiet. To quiet, the crowd doesn't cheer. They grumble, better than to show fear. But the chill on your back is not from the wind. The second prisoner is brought forward. The woman, she kneels. And then without warning, shit begins to sing. It's not loud, a melody in a language half the audience doesn't know. But it spreads like fire. A few people hush, others listen. You raise the blade again, and for the first time in a long while, your hand shakes. The chant resumes, punny, louder, now, frantic. You swing again. The song ends with the sound of metal meeting flesh. But the crowd is not pleased. They want it screaming. They have grace. And now, they look to you. You walk off the sand slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. You don't fear the condemned. You never did. But you fear the crowd, because they're the ones who never run out of thirst for more, and they always remember a man who didn't entertain them enough. The sun was low in the sky when you finally slipped back into the holding chambers beneath the Colosseum. The roars of the crowd still echoed in your ears. But down here in the stone corridors and blood-slick stairwells, the handle was sticky, even after the hasty wipe-down you'd given it. The woman's song still rang in your mind. It hadn't been triumphant, or pleading, or even bitter. It had been, go calm, gentle, almost. And her death so quiet, so full of composure, had infuriated the crowd in a way that loud violence never could. There was only quiet broken occasionally by the creak of a chain or the heavy breathing of men still preparing the beasts for the final act. You sat alone on a bench near the armory, your sword resting across your knees. They had expected screams. Please. Not her religion. Not even the accusation of poisoning a noble. It was her ability to take control of her death and rob the arena of its appetite. A fight. Blood in wide arcs. Not neat trickles. Don't let them die so serene. You were used to this, but the line had shifted just a little. You were already skating close to the edge. You disappointed the crowd. You stood where the emperor sometimes sat high above the pit, where you could see every drop of sand, every smear of rust-colored stain. You wondered how many people had died there since the arena was built. Thousands, surely, maybe tens of thousands. He'd been retired for years, living quietly in the southern district, tucked between bathhouses and silversmiths. He greeted you with a nod and poured watered wine without asking. The people don't want saints. The Colosseum was quiet, undergoing cleaning and preparation for the next string of events. A lion mauling, a gladiator duel, and a series of public floggings. For tax evasion, you are not assigned to any of these. They want sinners screaming. Instead, they got defiance wrapped in silence. That was the danger. You serve the people, but they never think you've done enough. They always want it bloodier, faster, louder. You knew that wasn't the end of it. As expected, one of the Idal's arena officials approached you not long after. One day, I came to work, and the guard turned me away. Told me someone else was handling the executions. He was red-faced and reeking of fig wine, his fingers stained with cinnabar ink, from tallying the day's wagers. What was that, executor? He spat. You're not paid to make martyrs. You're paid to entertain. Called Rome a viper, a murderer, and a coward. The people booed. Someone threw a fig at his face. It hit his temple, split, and dribbled down like blood. You said nothing. As always, don't do that again. This time, it was a rebel leader of Gaul, taken in a border skirmish sentence to die by public burning. A rare punishment. Brutal. Meant to send a message. The man was dragged out, half naked, bloody, and chained. You stood nearby. Your torch held low. The crowd was already on its feet. You suspected it was chosen for you as much as for him. It didn't matter that the fire roared up and the man screamed as expected. What mattered was that second. That blink of pause. He stalked off before you could respond, not that you would have. The same way you might look at a baker whose loaves have started to fall flat, and Rome had a long memory when it came to disappointment. The next day was a rest day. No games. No blood. But you came anyway. It was safer to be present. To remind them you were still willing. You walked the stands. Empty now. The stone seats baking in. The midday sun. And you wondered how many were remembered. That evening, you visited a man named Servios. Another former executioner. Not as faces, but as one giant mouth. Wide. Open. Screaming. Not from hunger, but from boredom. He knew why you were there. They're whispering, he said. Said you made the crowd uneasy. You nodded. They'll be watching next time, wanting you to prove yourself again. Worse than a promotion. Really. He smiled the toothless smile. It doesn't end. You ask him why he retired. I didn't, he said. They just stopped calling me. Said I'd gone soft. He poured more wine. No notice. No. Thanks just ... gone. That night, you sharpened your blade until your hands cramped. When the next games resumed, you were back on the schedule. They wanted to see if you could still deliver. The fire was prepared in the center of the arena. Dry wood, soaked in oil. He shouted curses as they brought him forward. When the guards stepped back, the arena went silent. You lit the torch, and as you stepped forward, you hesitated. Just a second. The crowd noticed. They always noticed. It didn't matter that you did your duty. You saw the looks on the faces in the front row. Suspicion. Displeasure. You'd failed their appetite again. And you knew someday, not far from now, they would come for you. Not with blades, but with forgetfulness. They'd simply stop needing you. Or worse, they'd feed you to the lions as punishment for a career that no longer entertained. That night, you dreamed of the crowd, and boredom, you realized, was what executioners feared most of all. Because when the crowd got bored of you, you became the next spectacle. You began to withdraw, carefully, quietly like a soldier backing out of hostile ground. No announcement, no declaration, just smaller gestures. You started letting others handle the binding. You volunteered for fewer executions. You took more time sharpening blades than swinging them. You hoped they wouldn't notice, but of course, they did. Idaus began assigning more duties to a younger executor named Crispisa, former centurion, with a booming laugh and a flair for performance. He dramatized his strokes, posed with bloodied swords, and even cracked jokes as prisoners were let in. The crowd loved him. You tried not to mind, let him have it. You thought, let the crowd feed on him instead. You told yourself that perhaps, finally, you could fade out in peace. No, my assignment. No, exile. Just a quiet vanishing. 3 men sat on a raised dais, city officials you'd seen only from a distance before. Their robes were too clean for anyone who lived honestly. Their words were measured but sharp. But Rome doesn't let people vanish. A crowd left unsatisfied. One morning, you were summoned not to the Colosseum, but to a tribunal chamber. You've served us for years, the elder said. But there are concerns. Quiet execution, internal discipline, behind walls, not before the people. Concerns, the second echoed, about your restraint, your failure to maintain crowd morale, your sensitivities. You kept your voice calm. I've always followed orders. Not always, the third said. There have been complaints. A woman who died too quietly. A fire was lit too slowly. The place looked different at night. Smaller, less grand. You touched the iron bars. You remembered the way the crowd screamed when a lion tore a man's chest open like paper. Just stone and sand, hollowed out of meaning without the screams. You waited. A small, carved token a child had once left on your bench, years ago, before the job turned you into a stranger. Dungeons, interrogations, political silencing, they continued. This isn't a dismissal, but we believe your duties are better suited elsewhere. Ethio as visible tasks. Prisoners who were meant to disappear, not confess. Your job was no longer about extracting information. It was about erasing problems. There was no appeal, no protests, just thoughts whispered while walking through the echoing tunnels. Thoughts like you had served too long to believe in justice. You knew what this meant. They were burying you alive. No more arena, no more daylight. You were being tucked into the folds of the city's darker systems places, where even the crowd didn't want to look. It was a promotion in name, a demotion in truth. You nodded once. You passed through the same gate you had used all those years. The stone walls hadn't changed. The smell hadn't either. That night, you returned to the Colosseum alone. You stood by the empty sands, lit by a single torch, mounted high on a pillar. Nothing. No dread. No pride. No need to explain. Just a tired rhythm of a job you never chose. You walked the perimeter slowly. Your footsteps echoed. You passed the beast cages, empty now, still reeking of urine and blood, or buried beneath the arena, or thrown to wolves. Rome never lacked 4 stories. The crowd still screamed, still alive, still working. Not your name, of course, just the machinery of Rome, the faceless gears that kept it spinning, but out of sight, still demanded. Nothing changing, and you wondered not for the first time why they needed it. What was broken in Rome, that such things were called justice? You returned home before sunrise and packed your few belongings. A dagger, your old soldier's ring. The next day, you reported to your new post, the Tullianum, the ancient underground prison, near the Forum, cold stone, little light. Your hands worked mechanically. A garrote here, a poison there, sometimes just a cloth over the face, and a bucket of water. No audience, no applause, no punishment for mercy. You finally preferred it. You started writing again only in your mind now, with no scrolls, no ink. Justice that depends on applause is no justice at all. Or, I was never afraid of what I did. Only one of you watched me do it. Years passed. Crispus rose in popularity, then felt he was injured in a failed beheading that turned the crowd against him. Rumor said he was exiled to Sicily. New faces took the stage. You, meanwhile, became a ghost. Only once did you see the arena again. You were escorting a senator's prisoner for a private execution. Well, you had, as the prisoner knelt before you mute with terror, face pale you felt, you made it clean, quick, almost reverent. And when it was done, you walked out alone. No crowd, no applause. No one is waiting for you at all. You returned to your chamber, lit a single candle, and sat quietly. You wondered not for the first time history would remember any of this. You had been one of them, but maybe the world didn't need to remember you. Maybe it was enough that you'd survived it. Barely. Just barely. You wake before the bells ring, not because you want to, but because the stench doesn't let you sleep past dawn. It seeps in through the shuttered windows, clings to the wool of your blanket, and settles in the back of your throat like a sour prayer. But you already know. The cart waits by the alley, just like always. The wood creaks with moisture, the iron-rimmed wheels coated in muck, and inside, an assortment of ragged cloths, half-broken tools, and thick rope-secured tools of the trade. Outside, the mist hangs low, curling along the cobblestones, like it's trying to hide what the morning light will reveal. You're a plague corpse collector. You're what they call in whispers, one of the men with the cart. Not a gravedigger, not a priest, not even an undertaker. Collect the dead, take them away, stack them like cordwood, and someone needed to haul them away. Not always wrapped. Sometimes they were already stiff, curled like shriveled leaves. Other times they were still warm, and you wondered if they had truly passed. You learned not to look at faces. You learned that the eyes stay open. You learned that mouths gape. You learned what a child's corpse weighs and how it is never enough to prepare you for the sound it makes when it hits the cart floor. Make room for the next, and the city's command to clear it before noon. You knocked with your hook. If no one answered, you entered anyway. People had stopped locking their doors. Your job is simple. You tried not to breathe through your nose, but the smell lived on your tongue. They always got there first. Sometimes, you'd find a home full of still living people sick, trembling, too weak to cry. You boiled vinegar and sniffed it until your eyes watered. And at night, you scoured your hands raw, lit candles, and tried not to dream of the things you saw. You weren't allowed to help them. Only the dead. No dogs. No birds. Just empty windows and that awful feeling that no one was left to watch you. You're not supposed to think too hard about it. And you didn't at first. When the pestilence first swept through the city, they told everyone to stay indoors, eyes open. He couldn't speak, but his chest rose and fell. Priests led processions, burning incense and chanting prayers into the air, as if words could stop the coughing. He wasn't begging, just asking. You dumped the bodies in. Sometimes they rolled. Sometimes they made a sound on impact. The guards didn't flinch. Neither did you. Some spat as you passed. Others crossed themselves and turned away. No one said thank you. The cart became your companion. You gave it a name, Mara. It didn't judge. It only carried what you gave it. And most of your shop apprentices, within the first 2 months, rent stopped coming in. The barrels stopped selling. You noticed the sounds instead, the creaking of wood, the slosh of decay, the faint crackle of bones settling under pressure. The flies were always there, clinging to your cloak, buzzing in your ears, and laying eggs in places you never could fully clean. You had strong arms and an empty purse. The city posted a notice. Pay for laborers, must not fear infection. But the bodies piled up anyway. At first, they were carried by family members' mothers, weeping, fathers' grim-faced children, too small to understand what they were helping to bury. But then families died together. You were out of work, a cooper by trade. The plague took your wife. You feared everything, but you signed up anyway. That first week was the hardest. You were given a cart, a cloak soaked in vinegar, and a pole with a hook. You were told not to touch the bodies with your bare hands. You were told to burn your clothes at the end of each week. You were told not to ask names. You followed instructions, but that didn't make it easier. The bodies were not always whole. Every morning began the same. A short route mapped by the bailiff, a list of homes to visit, and you did. Inside, the houses smelled worse than the streets. Sour milk, rotten bread, old urine. You hated the rats most of all. On the street, people avoided you. By mid-morning, your cart was full. You stopped noticing the weight. The drop-off point was outside the walls, a pit, not a graveyard, not a holy place, just a trench dug in haste, lined with lime, and watched by 2 bored guards with rags over their mouths. You had started to believe the rumors that plague collectors lived shorter lives, that you were already infected, that your cough meant your time was coming. But the days stretched on, and you didn't die. Instead, you learned to survive. You started layering wax under your sleeves to trap the fleas. You stuffed rosemary into your hood. The worst wasn't the bodies. It was the quiet, the way a whole neighborhood could fall silent. One morning, you found a man still alive in a pile. He moved barely. You stood there, hook in hand, torn between duty and fear. The man reached out a hand, thin, bone and skin. You backed away. You told the guards he was already dead. That night, you couldn't sleep. Not because of what you did, but because you wondered how many others you had missed or had chosen not to see. And you asked yourself, were you a plague collector or a silent executioner? And would anyone remember the difference? You learned early on that the dead weren't the only burden. The true weight, you realized, came from what they left behind. Houses full of silence and rotting bread, letters no one would read, candles burned down to wax stumps, toys on the floor, doors ajar, pots still simmering on ashes, long gone cold. Life stopped mid-motion, frozen in time by something too small to see but too vast to escape. You tried not to linger in the homes. It wasn't your job. You were paid per cart, not per hour. But some places demanded attention. There was something sacred, or maybe just awful, about the way families had arranged themselves into thorns around each other, mouths open mid-breath, rosaries still clenched, all laid out on the floor, wrapped in a single sheet. Someone had tried to preserve them. You could smell the herbs, thyme, cloves, and onions spread around like a feeble defense. The youngest child still held a wax doll. One house near the Tenari had 6 books, a man, his wife, 3 children, and a servant. You stood there too long. Details blurred. Eventually, everyone became just another weight, another body to balance on the heap. You took the bodies, of course, who clawed at your arms, mouths foaming, too weak to stand, but too strong to ignore. They haunted you. Worst of all, that was the job. But you couldn't forget the smell of cloves after that. 4 weeks. It made you nauseous. You began to notice patterns. The poor neighborhoods went quiet faster when you couldn't bring yourself to lift someone who might still be alive. People there had no space to separate, no fresh linens, and no windows to open, or prudence. Barely. Inflation rose. Coin lost weight and value. Bread became scarce. You took your wages in wine, candles, and vinegar-soaked cloth. You stopped asking for more. You were alive. That seemed like enough. Or something in between. The infection swept through in days. The richer quarters held out longer. But the outcome was the same. Some tried to flee, but the gates were closed. A few you never saw again after a particularly bad house stole once with blackened skin and bloodied sheets. You started working alone, by choice, and by default. A man whose hands were ink-stained, likely a clerk. You thought maybe, in some small way, it was a form of respect. No one left, not officially. Rumors said bribes opened secret doors in the city wall, but you never saw it. Instead, you saw those who stayed behind maids, paid to care for their masters who succumbed in turn, nuns who scrubbed dying men with bare hands, and old widows who refused to leave the sides of their sick sons. They all ended up in your cart. They'd taken something you could see, the empty vials. No struggle, no signs of panic, just peace, or at least the closest thing to it. Clean the cart, burn your gloves. You lied. Said the house was already empty. They shrugged. You had taken to living in the city's old granary, away from others. No one wanted you nearby, not because you were unclean, but because you were a reminder. Sleep lightly. Repeat. At first, you tried to remember faces, not names. You rarely learned those but details. A woman with silver pins in her hair, a boy with a torn boot, but your memory grew crowded. Except when they didn't. There were the screamers. You paused in the street, lifting your face to the sky. It struck you that it had been weeks since anything had felt cool. The plague brought heat fever, sweats, and decay, but the rain cut through that. People who weren't quite dead, who gasped as you tried to lift them. You never killed anyone, at least not with your hands, but you left them behind sometimes. When the house was too dark, when the breath was too shallow, you convinced yourself it was mercy. The city kept paying. Other collectors came and went. Some lasted a day, others a week. There were no friends in your trade, only ghosts. And still, every day, the same routine. Wake before dawn, collect the cart, haul the bodies, dump them in the trench. One day, it rained. Not a drizzle, but a proper downpour, lashing the rooftops, washing the alleys. For a moment, it smelled clean. It only lasted an hour. Then the mud returned, thicker and fouler, and your cart nearly tipped turning a corner. You pushed on. At the next house, you found something new. A letter, pinned to the door with a rusted knife, written in a shaky but still legible hand. We are already gone. Do not bring us to the trench. We have chosen our grave. You hesitated. Against your better judgment, you entered. Inside, 4 bodies lay in a neat circle, around a fire that had burned itself out. You followed their instructions. You returned to the cart empty. The guards at the trench questioned you. They didn't care about truth, only totals. That night, you stayed awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling of your room. You were the end of the road, the final visitor, the last face the dying would see. You wondered who would collect your body when the time came, who would hook your limbs and haul you from the floor, who would stand in your home and not say your name. And you thought perhaps no one, perhaps the cart would sit outside, waiting, while your own hands went cold. It was the third month when you finally stopped counting. You had tried, in the beginning lines, scratched into the side of your cart, tiny notches on a board in your granary room. Not to track but he's there. Were too many but days, just days. A mark for each morning you survived. Each dawn you loaded another heap of limbs and cloth into Maria's warped belly. But at some point, even the wood gave up, softened with damp, warped under your knife. Like everything else in the city, it surrendered. There were fewer people now, not fewer bodies, but fewer living ones to speak to, shout at, and beg. Now you were told to take the dead to the second trench, dug in haste near the southern fields. It was less organized, less guarded, just a pit in the earth, haphazardly lined with lime and littered with bones that hadn't stayed buried. The dogs came at night. So did the crows. You started throwing the bodies in faster, more roughly, trying not to meet the blank gaze of half-skinned skulls already at the surface. Doors no longer creaked open when you passed. Windows stayed shut even on hot days. Entire streets grew quiet. Hugh walked through a lane and hear nothing but the wheels and the squelch of your own boots. Did someone once kiss this face? The bodies spilled into the mud. Legs splayed. A hand slid into the gutter. A face stared upward, tongue lolling through parted lips, as if trying to taste the air one last time. That silence, the deep kind. The kind that feels like cloth pressed against your ears, settled into your bones. The smell of death clung to your clothes, to your skin, and to your hair. The way she used to hum while drying spoons. You'll remember burying her in a shallow grave behind the workshop. You were meant to return, to mark it properly. You never did. No vinegar or herbs could touch it now. You couldn't tell if he was sick. You couldn't even tell if he was real. But he didn't run. He watched you pick up each body, one by one, back into the splintered cart. You left the face for last. Just your cloak, your hook, your eyes. You knew the houses by heart. You no longer prayed, not because you had given up on God, but because he had clearly left first. The trench outside the city had been filled weeks ago. One day, your cart broke. The rear axle cracked. As you turned onto a sloped street, you stood in the rain, motionless, unsure whether to cry, curse, or retch. A cough, a kettle, a low voice humming. A bueno, more than 12 watched from behind a corner. He didn't speak, just stood there, clutching a wicker basket. And as you lifted it, you thought, was she ever beautiful? It was a dangerous thought. You tried to push it away, but it lingered. The boy was gone when you turned back. That night, you didn't sleep. Instead, you sat by the broken cart and lit a small fire. You thought of your wife, her hands, her laugh. In the morning, you walked the city without the cart. You didn't need a list anymore. But something changed that day. No one watched anymore. You stopped entering. You just looked. Some homes, you knew, were full of rots and shadows. He stared at you, recognition flickering in his eyes. But others had new sounds. Someone had survived. A door was left open to let in the light. You knocked once, lightly. No answer. You walked on. That evening, you returned to the trench. The ground was hard. Your fingers bled. Everything smelled of smoke and lime and sorrow. But this time, you carried something else. Not a body. A torch. The trench smelled worse than ever. Flies swarmed in sheets. Dogs balked from the hills. The guards were gone now. You tossed the torch in. The flames caught slowly. The wood was wet. The cloth burned black. You stood there for hours, not because it was part of the job, but because it felt like the only honest thing left to do. The next morning, You sat by your broken cart. You didn't patch the axle. You didn't go to the magistrate. You just sat waiting. A man passed the tailor. From the look of him, he nodded once. Still working, he asked. You didn't answer? He left. The wind picked up. Ashes drifted through the streets now. From the pyres, from the homes that were burned in desperation. But here and there, you began to see signs of life returning. A woman sweeping her doorstep, a child feeding a cat. You didn't collect bodies anymore, not because the job was finished, but because it had finished you. One evening, weeks later, you buried your own hook beneath a fig tree on the edge of the city. You didn't mark the spot. You just walked away. And you thought when your time came, when your body cooled in some forgotten corner, maybe someone else would carry you. Maybe not. Maybe the earth would take you gently, like dust returning to dust, like silent swallowing sound, like a cart finally coming to rest. You are not the torturer. You are not the priest. You do not ask questions. You do not render judgment. You are the one who writes it all down. Every confession, every accusation, every broken name whispered under pressure. The names, the places, the dates meticulously copied into leather-bound ledgers with black ink that smudges when the room is too damp. That is your job. You are a clerk in the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. A quiet one, and that is the only reason you are still alive. That was rare enough. Your uncle, a minor friar in Zaragoza, taught you your letters. When the church came recruiting, he offered your name. You were 17. You took the position because you could read and write. Now, a decade later, your fingers are permanently stained with ink. Your back is bent. Your ears are sharp, tuned to voices cracking under pressure, to whispered denials that turn into hoarse confessions. The chamber is always cold. The walls drip in winter. In summer, it is close and stifling, heavy with the stink of sweat and fear. There are no windows, only a single candle, a rough table, and sometimes two, sometimes three, always seated above, always in shadow. Just listen, record, transcribe. You sit below with your quill and your ledger, and you write. Others curse. Some weep before a word is spoken. At first, you thought the job would be simple, but nothing about this work stays simple. The accused are brought in limping, bound, and barefoot. Some whisper prayers. You're not meant to see them as people. You developed a shorthand for phrases that repeated often, under pain of confession. Not because you hesitated, but because you wanted to remember the person who said it. Their face, their voice, their tremble. In presence of the tribunal, and instruments of clarity applied. But of course, you do. You remember the apothecary's daughter, who wouldn't stop quoting scripture. You remember the old man with trembling hands, who claimed his dreams were messages from St. Augustine. You remember the tailor, who had simply argued that bread should be baked on Sundays. You remember the midwife who owned too many herbs. It's about the record. You wrote every word they said, a single line from a confession. You pointed out a contradiction to the senior scribe. And then you wrote the confessions. Some were real. Many were not. You knew the signs. When a prisoner said, "Yes, I danced with the devil," he couldn't describe his face. When they said, "I cursed my neighbor's cow," they didn't know the animal's name. When they said, "I renounced the church," their eyes were glazed from lack of sleep. Still, you wrote it all. Your script became neater over time, more efficient. You learned to write faster without block. It was quiet tonally, the sound of quills scratching and the occasional sneeze or cough from the other clerks. You opened a volume from 5 years prior, flipping idly. You also learned how to pause, just briefly, before transcribing something truly damning. Your ledger didn't capture those, only the words. And words, you learned, are flexible things. Once you questioned a phrase. He looked at you like you were mad. "It's not about the truth," he said. You never questioned again. The ledger is always balanced. That's what they tell you. For every heretic condemned, a soul is cleansed. just to remember. For every accusation followed through, a city grows safer. Not their crimes, just their names. Nothing more. You want to believe this. Sometimes you almost do. But then you think of the young woman who recited her catechism perfectly better than you could and still confessed to lying with demons, simply because they hadn't let her sleep for 3 days. You think of the priest who gave communion in the wrong order and begged forgiveness on his knees, only to be assigned to penance in isolation. You wrote it all, and then you watched them disappear. Some came back. Most did not. You were told not to ask where they went. One evening, you stayed late in the scriptorium, cataloging entries. That's when you saw your own uncle's name, Friar Alonso. Your teacher, your sponsor, accused, favoring unsanctioned texts, confessed, reading commentaries by a sentence, extended silence, and spiritual reassignment. You never saw him again, and now you knew why. The next morning, you stitched the book closed without a word. You never told anyone, but something shifted after that. You started adding flourishes to the name's curved lines, elegant swirls, tiny marks only you would recognize, not to draw attention. You began to carry a small scrap of paper in your sleeve, listing the people who never returned. You told yourself it wasn't rebellion, it was reverence. But even so, you checked your own name daily. You made sure it stayed off the ledgers. And you kept writing, because if you didn't, someone else would. And perhaps you thought it was better that a man who cared held the quill, even if his ink was soaked with silence. By now, your hand no longer cramps, your fingers don't blister, the ink no longer stains your nails, because it's already deep in the cracks of your skin. It's part of you. Your ledger has grown heavier over the years. Not in physical weight, though. Each volume is thick, bound in calfskin, and warped with age-bud in what it holds. Names. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. You've filled dozens of volumes. Neat rows of letters. Whole lives reduced to statements written in passive voice. The accused did admit. The tribunal finds sufficient cause. The sentence was carried out. At least, that's what they tell you. You never write I. Never write we. The ledger is not personal. It is sacred. But in your mind, the ledger has become something else. A mausoleum. Accused by a neighbor for refusing to kneel during a procession. He claimed his knee was injured. It wasn't enough, he confessed, through tears, to pride in the face of holy observance. You remember how he flinched when the Inquisitor smiled. You wrote it down. You saw him once afterward, scrubbing the chapel floor, lips chapped, eyes swollen. Then he was gone. You remember certain entries, even now, not because they were particularly dramatic, but because something about them felt wrong. There was Brother Ignacio, who stuttered through his confession. He admitted to praying too closely to nature. The Inquisitor wrote pantheism. There was Don Ernesto, an elderly merchant, taught local girls to read. Someone one would say, who claimed she had spoken against a sermon on damnation. You remembered the way she sat during questioning. Upright, still, no tremble in her voice. And there was her name you traced more than once. A woman of letters. Mid-30s owned several books in Latin and Greek. That perhaps fear should not be the root of faith. She denied the charges. Firmly. Repeatedly. For 5 days. Then, on the 6th, she confessed. She said she had doubted the fire of hell. That she had wondered whether God could be both merciful and vengeful. Cementing it in the church's memory. The Inquisitor beamed. You wrote every word. Just a handful of pages, tucked behind a false panel in your desk, but you saw it in her eyes. She had not been broken. She had chosen her words carefully, confessed just enough to satisfy, just enough to survive. She was sentenced to solitary prayer and confiscation of all her books. You watched her leave with her head high, and you never saw her again. The books were burned. You watched that, too. You began to wonder, were you truly a recorder or a participant? If discovered, the second ledger would condemn you as surely as a heretical text. Each quill stroke gave legitimacy. Each copied name sealed a fate. You weren't just writing what happened, you were making it real. And so you started a second ledger, a hidden one. Small, the accused, was a thin, older Jesuit, with wrists bound with silk cords. His face was gray, reserved for higher-ranking accused, clergy, wealthy scholars, even minor nobility. You were chosen because your Latin was stronger than most. In it, you wrote truths, not full ones, not full names, just fragments. Said he only agreed after his sister was taken. Did not understand the words in his own confession. Laughed during the sentence not from joy, but despair. Confessed only after hearing screams from the next room. You didn't know why you wrote these things. You knew they couldn't be shared. But you needed it, because otherwise, your soul might crumble beneath the weight of obedience. One day, you were summoned to transcribe a new type of proceeding and interrogation, held entirely in Latin. The chamber was the same, but colder. The men seated at the table wore darker robes. There was no priest only. He spoke slowly, carefully, as they questioned him. He had written essays on grace, on faith without fear, on salvation through reason. His writings had circulated in secret, read aloud in private gatherings. Someone had betrayed him. You wrote his answers faithfully, but you also watched the way the inquisitors leaned forward, pounced on every pause, every vague phrasing. You say reason has a place in belief. You suggest it replaces revelation. You deny hell's flames due. You also deny justice. He never wept. He never begged. At the end, he said, "If I must choose between silence and truth, then may silence take me." That was enough. You wrote it all down. And that night, you copied his last line into your secret ledger. The next day, he was removed from his cell. Not to prayer, not to exile, to the stake. You weren't invited to the burning, but you heard about it, quietly, among the other scribes. Someone said he recited scripture until the flames silenced him. Someone else said he never made a sound. You believed both. After that, you began sleeping less. Your hands trembled more often. You grew careful with your ink. Too many blots could raise questions. But you never stopped writing, because someone, you told yourself, needed to remember what had truly been said beneath the screams, behind the confessions, between the lines. And even if your second ledger was someday found, and you with it, at least you would not have died a silent witness. The chamber is colder now, not just because of winter's breath seeping through the stone, but because you've changed. You used to arrive early, ink fresh, quills cut at sharp angles, your chair pulled precisely to the center of the scribe's desk. Now, you arrive quietly, unseen. You no longer take pride in your penmanship. You still write clearly, but not with the same careful flourish. You still nod respectfully when the inquisitors enter the chamber. You still rise. You still dip your pen with steady fingers. But something inside you, something once silent and dutiful, has started to stir. You've stopped seeing the ledger as a record. Now, it feels like a tomb. Every entry feels heavier, like the names are dragging you toward some invisible reckoning. It began the day they brought in the child. Finally, exhausted, he admitted to saying something he shouldn't have. The inquisitors nodded. They called it heresy, born of the devil's whisper. The child was sentenced to isolation and re-education in a month. 12, maybe 30, accused of mimicking a blasphemous joke told by a stable boy. A priest had overheard. The child said it was only a joke. He didn't understand what the words meant, but that didn't matter. The tribunal demanded a confession. The boy sobbed. The knight then begged. You wrote all of this down, but you didn't stop there. The hall was grand, with marble floors and painted ceilings. The archbishop greeted you with cool eyes and folded hands. For the first time, you wrote a full paragraph, not just a line. You added an extra page to your private ledger that night. The child knew no evil. The sin was fear, not faith. His crime was being overheard. His penance is a life haunted by walls and silence. And we all stood and watched. You closed a secret book, and didn't touch it for a week, but your mind couldn't stop writing. You noticed how often confessions included the same details: a black cat, a midnight whisper, and a feast without prayer, as if fear had a template, as if the people had learned what to say to end the questions. You began to read between the lines of the official ledger's patterns, repetitions, and you wondered how much of this was ever real. You asked no one, but the questions sat in your gut like spoiled wine. Then one morning, you were called to the Archbishop's office, an unusual summons. You'd never been there before. If you are reading this, then you, like me, have listened too closely. You sealed it with wax and dust, making it look untouched for years. You never checked on it again. Perhaps you felt it, too, that strange tremble in the words, the way truth erodes under repetition. I leave this not as defiance, but as memory, because someone should remember the ones who were lost. Not because they were guilty, but because they were caught in the wheel. There is concern, he said, that certain entries in your ledgers reflect inconsistencies. Your breath caught, not the secret ledger. Not yet. Wrote with diligence. Avoided eye contact. Confine yourself to the work. You stopped whispering prayers. You just listened. And you wrote. But close. There is also concern, he continued, that you linger in chambers after proceedings. That you have been observed. Pausing. Reflecting. Longer than your role requires. You still came in each day, but your role shrank like old parchment in damp air. You gave a measured nod. I record only what I hear. You said he studied you long enough for you to feel the sweat pool between your shoulder blades. Finally, he dismissed you. But the warning was clear. That evening, you removed your secret ledger from its hiding place. You didn't destroy it. Instead, you added one final entry. I do not know how long I have before this is discovered. You wrapped the book in oiled cloth and slipped it beneath a loose stone behind your desk. A month passed. Then too, you kept your head down. One morning, a new scribe arrived on, eager and nervous. You were told to train him. You showed him the protocols, how to sharpen quills without fraying, how to keep ink from blotting, how to hold silence in the presence of pain. He watched you closely, asked few questions, but one day he leaned over the desk and whispered, "Do you ever wonder if they're telling the truth?" You looked at him for a long time, then said, "Wondering doesn't change the ink." He didn't ask again. Years passed. Your hand began to tremble more than your voice. You copied fewer pages, assigned more to your assistant. One winter morning, you didn't wake at dawn. Your heart, it seems, had decided it had written enough. When they found your official ledgers stacked neatly, pens cleaned, chair pushed in. They did not find the other book. No one ever did. But maybe someday someone will, and maybe they will wonder who you were. They won't find your name in the records, you made sure of that. But they will find your voice ink-stained and silent, tucked between pages meant to be forgotten. And maybe that will be enough. The bucket sloshes on your hip as you walk. It's not the kind of splash that comes from water. No, this sound is thicker, almost syrupy. A slow, glugging churn that would make most men gag. You've grown used to it. The leeches inside your wooden pail wriggle and slap against the sides, tangled in their own slime. Always moving, always hungry. In most cities, you stand just below the butcher on the invisible social ladder. But at least the butcher deals with animals that are already dead. You handle creatures very much alive. You are a leech seller. Technically, you're more than that. You're a gatherer, keeper, seller, and on some unlucky day, and they live off blood. This morning, like every morning, you set up your little stool by the apothecary's stall in the town square. He doesn't like you being there. You undercut him, but you have a license from the guild, stamped and sealed. Most people don't know how many leeches to use. You do. No one likes leeches, but everyone eventually needs them. Your tools are simple. Your bucket, a set of tin scoops, small cloth pouches soaked in brine to keep the leeches moist, and a carved stick with maces to measure out proper doses. To 4 swelling, 5 for fever, 7. If they're cursed, you tell them. Physicians called for leeches. Daily bleeding patients was all the rage. Too much blood, they said, caused everything from headaches to lust. Leeches were nature's doctors. No one ever questions the curse part. Well-dressed boys with curled hair who wrinkle their noses and pretend not to make eye contact. They buy the best specimens, the darkest, plumpest ones, and often ask if the leeches are foreign. You lie and say yes. Say they're from the German bogs, or the Nile, or a monastery pond near Ovine. You learned the trade from your aunt, who learned it from her father. Back then, it was a respected position. He never speaks, just drops the coin into your palm and walks away with a nod. But lately, things have changed. Every week, you walk there at dusk, barefoot, trousers rolled, stepping slowly through mud that sucks at your feet like hungry mouths. The leeches latch quickly. You let them feed just a little before, plucking them off and dropping them into your jar. More barbers are offering bloodletting themselves. Some physicians brew tonics instead. Some, even heresy of heresies, have started questioning whether bloodletting works at all. The room smells of mold, old wood, and rusted iron. But it's quiet. You prefer it to the market. You don't argue with any of them. No sermons praising your service. You are part merchant, part healer, and part reviled oddity. You just sit and wait. Your clients are varied. An old baker with swollen legs buys for every week. That the priest who calls you unclean used your services when his belly swelled like a pregnant cow. That half the women in town quietly knock on your door at dawn, asking for something natural to help them feel lighter, purged. Just gave him the pouch and took the coin. A midwife buys them by the handful, claims leeches help after birth, pains and stubborn fevers in newborns. His wrists were red, eyes glassy. You told him 3 leeches would help. He begged for 10. People say they draw out poison, sin, lust, and guilt. You've heard it all. They never blame the leech when things go wrong. Then there are the nobles. They send servants. Of course, she said. Her husband died after a leeching. He bled too long, she shouted. They never stopped feeding. The leeches had nothing to do with it. They pay more when the story is exotic. The truth is less romantic. You get your leeches from a marsh 2 miles outside town. You locked the cellar and walked until your feet blistered. You bleed the whole walk back, but that's how you know they're strong. Each night after gathering, you rinse them in vinegar water, sort them by size, and store them in a dark cellar under your cottage. There is no guild for leech sellers, no feast days. Children dare each other to poke your bucket. Drunks shout things like, "How's the blood soup? Worm boy." You ignore them, but sometimes you wonder, do they know that the town physician bought 20 leeches from you last week? You see more desperation than most. Not from the sick, but from those pretending not to be. One man came to you with shaking hands, claiming he just had a touch of the heat. "I need to bleed it all out," he said. Every bad thought. You didn't ask more questions. You've long stopped believing bleeding cures much, but people need something to believe in. Leeches are useful for that. They are visible, alive, and hungry. You can feel them work. They blame you. Once, a merchant's wife came, screaming to your stall. She struck you across the face. You didn't argue, but you knew the truth. He had taken too much wine. His liver was ruined. You still remember the slap, though. Still remember the way the crowd stared, but no one spoke. That night, you almost let the leeches feed on you again. Not for harvest, just to feel something. But you didn't. And in the distance, you heard frogs calling in the marsh. The only creatures that don't judge you. You wonder sometimes when you grow old and die who will leech you. Will they know your trade? Will they laugh when they see the buckets? Or will they wrinkle their nose and say, "Disgusting," before tossing your tools away? You sigh. A woman approaches the stall, eyes red. "My husband has bad blood," she whispered. You nod, reaching for the pouch. She doesn't ask for a receipt, only for relief. And you realize for all their revulsion, their laughter, their insults, they still come. Because leeches, like you, serve their purpose in the dark corners of life. Quiet, unwanted, but necessary. The woman comes back 3 days later. Her eyes are still red, but now it's from sleeplessness. Her husband, she says, isn't improving. His skin has turned yellow. He speaks in slurred riddles and forgets her name. She bought leeches from the apothecary this time. He charged twice as much. They didn't move, she says. Didn't bite. You don't explain to her that leeches, like people, can be that after too many bodies, too much rot, too much unnatural blood, they simply stop reacting. That they have limits to. You take one of your own jars from beneath a stool. These are fresh, thin, still hungry. You offer it without a word. She hesitates, then takes it. Do they know what they're doing? She whispers. The physicians. You shake your head slowly. You wrote it in your own hand once, with red ink. You thought it would be clever. A joke no one laughed at. They know how to sound like they do. She leaves without saying goodbye. It matters that something is being done. You've learned that people want the illusion of control, the weight of a remedy in the palm. It doesn't matter if it works. You've learned to sort the sluggish ones from the lively. The apothecary still glares at you each morning, especially when you undercut his prices. And so your stall remains. She carried her stock in ceramic pots tied with twine and kept a copper spoon for sorting. You've had it for over 10 years. Same corner, same stool, same warp sign that reads, leeches clean, fresh, effective. Other vendors have come and gone. A cheesemonger to your left died during the summer plague. The wool merchant opposite moved south when trade slowed. But no matter what the town goes through, blood remains constant. You've seen the market shift with the season's bred riots in winter, flower stalls in spring, and stinking fish carts in summer. And you deal in blood. They don't live long, but the best ones, those with a particular gleam, a readiness to feed stay in your memory. There's a rhythm to your work. Every few weeks, you return to the marsh. You stop bleeding yourself. That was a young man's way. Now, you bring pigs' bladders filled with warm water and a bit of cow's blood. You recognize the seal on his gloves. He works in the magistrate's office. You dangle them in the water, standing still as statues, letting the leeches find them. A local alderman, pious in public, sharp-tongued in court. His priest stands nearby, reading quietly from a book. You are a tool, not a guest. He once called your stall a gutter for worms. They still latch, greedy and eager, but not all of them survive. Some swell too quickly, some die in the jar. You give the sluggish to the people who treat you poorly. You tell yourself it's fair. Once, years ago, you met another leech seller, a woman from the coast. She was older, crinkled like seaweed. Don't get sentimental about them, she told you. They're vermin, but they're useful vermin. You nodded, but you didn't agree. You do get sentimental. You've started naming the oldest ones. Redcap sickle, bentail. You bury them when they die. A small patch behind your cottage, next to the compost pile. You dig tiny holes and say nothing aloud. But you remember, one day, a young man in fine clothes approaches your stall. I've come on behalf of Master Grantius, he says. He requests a private leeching. Discretion required. You know the name. You nod. You arrive that evening at the back of a large stone house. You are led inside through a servant's passage. No one speaks to you. Grantius lies in bed, sweating. His belly is distended. You're late, Grantius. You weren't. You kneel beside him. The priest leaves the room. You unwrap your satchel. This'll hurt, he asked. You select 3 leeches. Thin, fast. You place one on his forearm, one behind his knee, and one near his navel. They latch quickly. He flinches, feels strange. You say nothing. After 10 minutes, the skin around each leech turns purple. He starts to relax. You see it in his breath. He thinks something is being fixed. They said it was bile, too much heat. You nod. You're one of them. The marsh folk. Not real physicians, but you work. He looks at you, eyes narrowed. You dip your cloth into vinegar and watch the leeches bloat. They take what needs taken. You say, later. You burn the used ones. These cannot be reused. Not from men like him. You are paid 3 silver. The next morning, he denounces the pagan filth in the market and orders new taxes on unlicensed remedies. He never mentions you. You're not surprised. But that evening, his servant returns to your stall. He says, 3 more, just like last time. You sell them. Triple the price. You say nothing. Who sneered? Who wept? Who thanked you? Who bled too much? Who walked away whiter than they arrived? Because in your line of work, silence is part of the medicine. Your ledger is not on paper. It's in your memory. You remember who came to you. No one keeps records for leech sellers. But you do. Each night, before sleep, you recite names in your head. Your own form of accounting. You do not forgive these, but you serve them anyway. Because that's the trade. You don't get a guild, or a saint, or a clean pair of gloves. You get mud, blood, slime, and coins that stink of hypocrisy. And you carry on. Because when the physicians fail, when the apothecaries run dry, when the church cannot save, they always return to the bucket. And 2, the frost comes early this year. You feel it in your joints before you see it on the grass. The marsh hardens overnight, turning the once wet soil into cracked husks that crumble underfoot. The leeches become sluggish. Some stop feeding. You lose more in the cellar this month than in the last 2 seasons combined. The little graveyard behind your cottage grows crowded. You still rise early, still sit your stool in the market square. But the faces passing you seem more hurried now, less interested. The fashion has changed. A new physician has arrived from the capital young, soft-handed and full of theories. That healing now comes from herbs, humors, and the measured hand, not slimy vermin. He wears silk gloves and speaks in long words, all while mocking your bucket as a rustic relic. He tells people that bloodletting is outdated, that leeches are swamp superstition. People listen. Some stop buying, others only approach at dusk, veiled, glancing over their shoulders, swollen throat, fevered. He can't breathe. The new doctor bled him once, then left, saying the illness was beyond curing. She doesn't believe him. You don't blame them. Shame is contagious, like fever. It creeps into the bones, making people deny even the hands that help them. But the sick still come, in secret. They always do. One night, a knock rattles your cottage door. It's a young woman, barely more than a girl. Her brother is sick, she says. You grab your pouch. In a home, a single candle flickers. You just listen to the sucking, to the boy's strained breathing, to the sound of her silent hope. The boy lies in bed, cheeks flushed, breath coming in rattles. You place 2 leeches at his jawline and another at the back of his neck. They latch slowly. The girl watches you, eyes wide. You don't speak. The apothecary moves to another town. The chismonger's son now sells colored powders, modern treatments, he says. You keep to your corner. The stool creaks more each day. The sign is unreadable now, worn soft by weather. After 20 minutes, the fever breaks. Slightly. The boy opens one eye, eyes jaundiced. His priest stands nearby, muttering prayers. You nod once, then leave. You ask for nothing. But the next morning, a basket sits on your doorstep. Inside, warm bread, dried lavender, and a clean strip of linen. You take it inside and weep for the first time in years, because someone remembered. The market continues to thin. More stalls close. Then one day, the magistrate's messenger returns. Master Grantius, he says, has taken ill again. Very urgent. You consider refusing, but you go. You arrive to find the alderman barely conscious. His gut is bloated again. This time, the leeches don't latch. You try for 5. They won't feed. Too sick. Too close to death, you whisper. It's done. Grantius groans. You meet his gaze. He knows. And in that moment, you feel a strange kinship be. 'Cause, like you, he sees the end coming and cannot stop it. You return home. You don't bring the leeches inside. You open the cellar and release them into the stream behind your home. We took the filth so others could pretend they were clean. The world forgot us before we were gone. But we were here, and we mattered. Some wriggle free. Some just drift. You sit beside the bucket for hours, listening to the water. A week later, you wake with a pain in your side. Deep, sharp. You cough. Red. You know what it means. You don't bother with town physicians. They wouldn't come anyway. You take the last of your coin and buy strong wine. You sit in your cellar, surrounded by empty jars, and you write one last note. This was a trade of quiet service. No pride, no parade. You drink. You wait. You bleed quietly. In the morning, someone finds your body. The priest says a short prayer. The magistrate orders your home cleared. Your tools are tossed in the rubbish. The cellar is sealed. The marsh forgets you. But somewhere, in someone's memory the warm bread, the lavender, the eyes of a boy who lived your name lingers. Not carved in stone, but remembered in need. And that, for a leech cellar, is enough. It starts with a chicken, a scrawny thing, missing half its feathers, was found dead behind a baker's shop. Neck twisted. No sign of struggle. Just lying there like it had dropped. The baker's wife says it's unnatural. She says she saw old widow Harwood whispering over her fence the day before. So the bailiff calls you. Not a judge. Not a priest. You. The witch finder. You thought you were saving souls, protecting innocence, and striking bargains with God on behalf of the terrified and the just. But now, you don't correct them anymore. That's not your real title. Officially, you're a parish investigator for the identification and reporting of but no one remembers that. They just say witchfinder and flinch when you pass. 10 years ago, you thought it was a calling. Now it's just another circuit, another town. The mayor or elder greets you, stiffly too warm, too forced. They invite you to stay in the guest house or the parish hall. You decline both. You prefer the edge of town, where the air feels cleaner and fewer people want things from you. Another suspect. You arrive with your ledger and your warrants. A horse that limps slightly from an old stone bruise, and a trunk full of iron pins, manacles, dried herbs, and a battered copy of Malleus Maleficarum. It's the same every time. You enter the village. Heads turn. Children, stop playing doors. Close. This village is like the last. Thatched roofs, muck-filled ditches. If she's ever had dreams, she remembers them too clearly. She answers with the fear of someone who knows that any word could tip her into the pit. A church with a leaning bell tower. They all claim their town is different, that they only called you because this one is serious. But it's always the same. A dead animal. Wears strange colors. Yes. Lives alone. Yes. But you've seen hundreds like her. She offers you tea. Her hands shake when she pours. There's no cauldron. No bone charms. No sulfur smell. A poor harvest. The neighbor's chimney smokes too early, she says. And once, she saw her walking backward by the well. A woman with a sharp tongue. Sometimes a man with a limp or a hair lip. Sometimes a child who stares too long at fire. You unpack your kit and go see Widow Harwood. She's old. Yes, just old loneliness. You ask her questions. Where she was, what she saw. If she's ever owned a cat, you don't mark her for arrest. Your fingers are stained with ink and something that might be pig-ass blood from an earlier examination. You try to sleep. Not yet. But the town was angry, and you hesitated too long. You've learned to wait. The first rule of witch-finding is this. Never accuse without witnesses. You make inquiries. You ask around. You listen for whispers. You check the church. Records baptisms, illnesses, fines, for missed mass. You watch who points fingers. It's usually the ones with something to hide. You've become a connoisseur of petty greed. One woman accuses her neighbor of flying at night. A farmer claims his cow soured after his niece played near Widow Harwood's hedge. A boy swears he saw a toad blink 3 times. When the old woman walked past, "This is your life. Not spells, not fire and brimstone, just bad milk, lost spoons, and blame wrapped in fear." You take notes in your ledger. Let him draw his own fire from them. You've grown tired of guiding. You document every name, every phrase, and every look of guilt disguised as righteousness. Then you return to your room and sit with your head in your hands. Your back aches. Your boots are still damp from the marsh outside town. You can't. You dream of names, not the ones in your book, but the ones who begged. The girl in Dorset, with the burn on her cheek, the one they said turned cream to blood. You knew she didn't. She's dead now. You still hear her voice. You wake before dawn and light a candle. You wonder how much longer you can do this. You wonder if you've already gone too far. You tell yourself you're a servant of justice, that, without you, real sorcery might go unchecked. But, deep down, you know most witches you found weren't witches at all. Just people in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemies. And you know the system isn't about proof. It's about pressure. The next day, the priest asks to see your notes. He is young, zealous, eager for a conviction. He uses words like purge and cleanse. You give him the pages, but not your thoughts. Let him see the scratches on the paper, the names and times and places. That night, the bailiff arrests Widow Harwood. You didn't order it, but you didn't stop it either. They want a trial. They want answers. They want someone to pay for the chicken. You lie awake, listening to the wind rattle your shutters. And you wonder not for the first time how many more towns you will pass through before you stop believing this is holy work. How many more hands you'll tie. How many more names will you write in ink that smells like blood. They chained Widow Harwood in the church cellar. That's the part most people don't know. The trial stuff, public pathos. Come later. The humiliation, the confessions, the flames, if it goes that far. But before any of that, there's waiting, cold, stone, moldy air, and the whispered prayers of the accused, echoing off the walls like smoke in a bottle. You visit her the next morning, at least. That's what you tell yourself. Not to comfort her. She just looks at you with tired eyes and says, "You know I didn't do it." To ask more questions. She doesn't beg. It always unsettles you more than the weeping ones. You nod. Because she's right. You sit on a barrel and take out your ledger. My legs are bad. It's the closest spot with Yarrow. You were seen near the baker's fence. I was gathering weeds. They say you spoke to the chicken. I said, "Shoo." You write it down anyway. Not because you believe it matters, but because there has to be a record. Something that says you followed the process, that it wasn't just fear and politics wrapped in ink. She looks at your hands as you write. "You're tired," she says softly. "Every new town means a new name, a new cell, and a new set of absurdities. Given the weight of law, you used to believe you were sifting lies from truth. Now it feels like you're just building bonfires from gossip." You don't respond, because she's right again. You've begun dreading the smell of wax, the feel of fresh paper, the sound of ink scratching into the page. 3 more animals have died. A girl had a nosebleed in church. A man claims his dreams are haunted. The mayor wants results. The priest says the town is infected. The townspeople are restless. They want it to stop. They raise glasses when they think you're not watching, but their toasts are sharp-edged. They want the bleeding to mean something. So they look to you. That night, you walk past the tavern. No one invites you in. A real crime is being poor and alone and inconvenient. To the witchfinder, someone sneers. May he find the devil hiding in his own damn coat. You don't turn around. You don't need to. You've heard worse. You return to your room and light a candle. You take out your ledger. Not the official one, the secret one. The mayor will nod gravely. The people will come, children hoisted onto shoulders, vendors selling apples, dogs barking. They'll say they're praying for justice, but they're here for a show. The one where you write what really happened. Widow Harwood is guilty of knowing how to boil herbs, of outliving her children, and of saying what she thinks without apology. You stop, put the quill down, look at your hand. The ink stains are so deep they've become your skin. You hear the church bell ring. Not for mass, BR tribunal. You know the routine. It feels more like a fair than a judgment. The trial will be held tomorrow, a public hearing in the square. The priest will read a passage from Leviticus. A test of water or fire will be used. A girl who claimed her dolls talked at night. Each of them had blamed someone else. Each of them had cheered when you found proof. They'll tie her thumbs to her toes and lower her into the pond. If she sinks, she's innocent. If she floats, she's guilty. Either way, she won't walk out free. You've seen it 100 times. You're tired of pretending the outcome is in your hands. You're tired of pretending this isn't theater. The next morning, you arrive late on purpose. The crowd is already gathered. The square smells of smoke and hay and sweat. Children hold sweetbread in sticky fingers. Someone plays a flute. Widow Harwood stands at the center, arms bound. She's barefoot. They've painted a red mark on her forehead. The priest begins to speak. You look at the crowd. You recognize faces from past trials. A butcher who once lost a pig, a baker whose loaves went flat during Lent. You're not here to speak. Your role is to observe, to verify, and to record, to ensure the proper rituals are followed. But as they begin tying her legs for the pond test, your voice surprises even you. Stop. The priest turns. The mayor frowns. The crowd murmurs. You step forward. I declare her case unfit for trial. The words hang in the air. Someone laughs nervously. She's a danger. The priest starts. I've seen no proof. You say. You hold up your official ledger. By law, no testimony was sworn. No evidence submitted. No formal witness. This is spectacle, not judgment. The crowd stirs. The mayor looks at the bailiff. The bailiff doesn't move, because no one's ever heard you say no before. The priest tries again. You protect her. You look at the woman. She's not smiling, but she's watching. I protect the law, you say, and it demands more than fear. It's not a dramatic moment. No one cheers. No one weeps. The crowd disperses slowly, grumbling, confused. But no torches are lit. No ropes thrown. You walk away. You know, this means you'll be dismissed. The circuit will end. You'll lose your title, but you feel lighter than you have in years. That night, you sit by your candle and write. Burnout doesn't come from fire. It comes from the ashes we carry, from the things we write down even when we know they're lies, from the names we forget until they come back to us in sleep. You close the book. You blow out the flame, and for the first time in a decade, you sleep without dreaming of smoke. The blade never sleeps. You know this better than anyone. Not because you're the one who drops it. That's the executioner's role. Not because you decide who kneels beneath. If that's 4 tribunals and mobs to sort out. No. Your job begins after the crowd cheers and the blood starts pooling. Most simply refer to you as Le Valet du Sang, the blood valet. You don't mind. You've had worse names in your life. Before this, you were a cooper's apprentice, then a street sweeper, then a grave digger. You are the guillotine's cleaner. That's what they call you. They call you anything at all. This job pays better, but it stains deeper. Your shift begins before the dawn bell rings. You arrive at Place de la before the crowd's swift humane. You glance at the schedule posted on a weathered nail. 17 names. Rationale. Before the bakers open their shutters. Before the butcher sharpens his cleaver. You approach the guillotine like a priest approaching an altar. Except your sacraments are buckets, brushes, and old rags. The machine looms above the square. A perfect piece of modern justice, they say. But when you get close, you see it for what it is. An engine of repetition. The wood is splintered in places. The frame smells of iron and rot. Some of them wave small flags, bearing the face of Marat or Robespierre. It is a carnival. The groove in the plank, where the neck rests, has grown dark, polished with use. You begin by checking the bucket, the one beneath the angled blade. Blood congeals quickly, especially in the chill of morning. You keep it tidy, friend, he said, laughing. That's patriotism. You took the drink but didn't reply. You used vinegar, then a lime mixture, scrubbing with a stiff brush until the wood lightens slightly. But sometimes they look at you before they kneel like you were the last person who might speak to them as a human. You work in silence. You've tried humming before, but it echoes strangely against the stone. Yesterday, it was emptied 3 times. Today, you expect the same. Nobles, priests, traders, bakers are accused of hoarding flour. A tailor who said the wrong name in the wrong tavern. Justice is efficient now. You begin your work, but you wipe it clean, polish the steel, and remove the flecks of tissue that always cling to the edges. No matter how careful you are, you catch what you can. You rinse the groove, you wipe the blades underside. The crowd doesn't care. They only want the next act. But the tribunal does. They expect order, cleanliness. A stage is ready for the next performance. First, you rinse the grooves. Next, the blade. It's not your job to sharpen it. That falls to the assistant executioner. There is a rhythm to this. Scrub, wipe, douse, repeat. You step forward to clean between the victims. By the time the sun crests the buildings, you are finished. You cleaned those sites, too. But there was something messier. More human, perhaps. Pain lingered longer. Death was slower. Then the crowds arrived. They bring bread and apples, wine and cheers. Children sit on their shoulders. You stay behind the scenes. The executioner nods at you and unspoken thanks. You nod back. Most of them don't notice you, but some do. You peel off your shirt and wash your arms in cold water. Laughter. Singing. The people celebrate their freedom. Your fingernails stay dark. No matter how much you scrub, the blood settles in the cracks of your skin. A man in a red cap once offered you wine after a session. Who kissed the hand of the assistant before she knelt? Who looked at you and said, "It must be lonely to stay after everyone else is gone." Once, a woman threw a flower onto the stage after the final drop. It landed near your bucket. You left it there. It wilted in the heat. The executions begin. You don't watch the faces anymore. You try not to. You never do. Your job begins when their heads roll. Between each sentence, you step up with your bucket and rag. The blood doesn't pour, it spurts, like a fountain that's lost its rhythm. The revolution is about efficiency, and your work reflects the new republic. You remember when it was different. Before the guillotine, they hanged people from carts, broke bones in the square, tied men to wheels, and crushed them slowly. The guillotine, they say, is progress, but even progress leaves stains. That afternoon, the blade jams. A priest's neck was too thick. The collar resisted. The executioner mutters a curse and resets the mechanism. The crowd grows restless. The priest's headless body jerks once, then stills. You mop the blood from the plank. Someone throws a stone. It misses you. Too slow. Someone shouts, "Get on with it." You do, because that's what you're paid for. You finish the day sore, reeking of vinegar and copper. The blood soaks through your apron. Your hands are raw. You walk home alone. You live in a room above a tannery. The smell is better than your work clothes. You boil rice and eat in silence. Sometimes you hear music from the square. You think of the woman this morning who didn't cry. You didn't answer. But now, in your room, you think she might have been the only one who ever saw you. Tomorrow, there are 12 more names on the list. You'll wait before the bell. You'll rinse the blade. You'll wait for the next round of justice. And when it's done, you'll clean it all away. Because someone has to The smell doesn't wash out, no matter how many times you scrub your apron, boil your hands in vinegar, or hang your boots in the window overnight. It clings to you. A mix of iron, sweat, and wood rot. You've grown used to the way people step away from you in line at the bakery, or how neighbors go quiet when you approach. They know what you do. They think the blade is the most terrifying part of the guillotine, but you know better. It's the silence afterward, after the cheers fade and the platform creaks empty, after the last head is bagged and the last body is carted away. You're still there, bent over a red groove, wiping, rinsing, watching the blood settle into the cracks of the planks, only to rise again when the vinegar hits it. The machine doesn't blink, but you do. And sometimes what you see behind your eyelids is worse. His hands shook when they tied him down. Not from guilt, from cold. More than usual. One of the guards laughed. There was a boy last week, no older than 16. They said he plotted against the convention, that he distributed pamphlets in alleys. You caught his eye as they let him up. He mouthed something. You weren't close enough to hear. Written in pencil. Mean poor less fables. When the blade dropped, his body twitched violently. You wiped down the grooves in silence. Next time he can write a play about it, he said. You didn't laugh. Later, you found a scrap of paper stuck under the platform, a torn page from a school book. One of them called you bleach because of how you scoured the boards. That was before the daily lists, before the names got longer, before the tribunal stopped pretending to care about charges and started talking about quotas, freedom, even for the weak. You didn't report it. You folded it once and put it in your boot. Now it stays in the lining, beside a pressed flower someone once dropped on the stage. A midwife, accused of aristocratic sympathies, because she attended the birth of a nobleman's bastard years ago. You saw her hands so calloused, so calm. The petals crumble a little more every time you walk. You've begun to wonder what you're becoming. You weren't always this way. You used to whistle while you worked, even made jokes with the guards. Once they never say it out loud, but you hear it between sentences. This one had cousins who fled to England. That one spoke too well. Some bring picnics. One man painted a watercolor of the guillotine mid-swing, head caught mid-air like an apple falling from a tree. He tried to sell prints near the square. She wore silk while the people starved. You clean after all of them. Guilt doesn't weigh any less than innocence when it congeals on the wood. Last week, they beheaded a woman who had delivered babies for half the district. She kissed the assistant executioner's hand before kneeling. It haunted you. You tried to work faster that day, but the blood wouldn't lift. You had to scrape the boards until slivers came off. That night, you dreamed of her humming while tying a bonnet. The crowds aren't changing. If anything, they're louder. They cheer for the blade like it's an actor in a grand play. You saw children clapping when a head rolled unevenly. You saw an old woman dab her eyes with a lace kerchief knot. From grief, but joy. I knew her, she said of the condemned. A terrible snob. Deserved every inch. It chills you more than the blood ever could. The executioner adjusts the blade's release pin, checking the weight. Accused of hoarding, you saw her once laughing with a gendarme years ago. He wasn't at her trial. Justice, they said, would purify France. But the water runs red every day. And if anyone ever found out what your job had been, they'd turn on you just as quickly. And you're the one holding the rag. You still do your job. You still arrive before dawn. You still check the screws and the chute and the groove. But now, before each session, you speak a name under your breath. Someone from the day before. Not loudly, just enough to remember. Today, it was Jeanette, the flower seller. You speak her name. Then you scrub. The guards don't notice. The assistant nods as always. You lay out your bucket, your brushes, and your claws. And you wait. You've thought about leaving. But where would you go? The stain is in your skin. You'd never get work in another trade. You carry the smell with you, because justice forgets. But people remember. And so you stay, because the machine must be cleaned, because the blood keeps coming, because someone must be there to see. Even if they never speak, even if their name is never known, even if their only legacy is a plank that doesn't stick beneath the next neck. By the end of that year, the executions slowed, not because the revolution softened, not because there were fewer names, but because fear had done its job. The crowd still came, but the fire in their cheers had dulled, like an old bell rung too many times. The guillotine still stood in the square, stained, still sharp, but even it seemed tired, its frame dark with weather, its platform groaning louder with each reset. You knew the sound of every part now. The creak of the ratchet, how to lift the body just enough for the aides to carry it without slipping. It was a choreography, a grim ballet. You were its silent partner. The thunk of a lunette as it locked a neck in place, the thick, wet slap as the head met the basket. No one wonders what happens to the rags, to the soiled clothes, or the ruined shoes. You burned them, or buried them in lime pits. Sometimes you just left them in the alley behind the tannery, where the rats would find them before morning. The seamstress who whistled as she walked up the steps, the priest who tried to bless the crowd before they gagged him, the young man who cried, not because he was afraid, but because he wouldn't see his mother again. You'd learned how to catch the spray, how to angle your bucket to keep the runoff from pooling too quickly under the frame. And you were exhausted. No one talks about what it feels like to clean up after death, every day, for a living. You stopped keeping count. He was gentle, kind, thought the world could be reasoned with. He once gave you a book about insects, saying your work with the dead made you uniquely attuned to the small things that live among rock. He'd hesitated to applaud a speech. Someone had noticed. You tried in the early days, names, dates, professions, but they blurred together. Now, you just remembered fragments. You spoke to none of them. That was your line. You kept your eyes low as they lowered his head. You heard him say, "Tell my mother I wasn't angry." And you clung to it until the day you recognized a name on the list. Julien de Rochier's your cousin. You passed shuttered shops, faded banners, and chalk slogans on brick walls. La-oh, you hadn't seen him in years. He'd gone south to teach, sent letters sometimes, and never spoke of politics. You read that book cover to cover. He was accused of seditious hesitation, a phrase that meant nothing and everything. And now, here he was. You didn't go to his cell. You didn't request his body after you did your job. You stood behind the frame as they tied his wrists. You blinked once, not because of the smell your body had forgotten how to flinch at that, but because the face had looked too much like someone you knew. The blade dropped. You stepped forward, cloth in hand, and wiped the groove. It was the cleanest cut of the week. That night, you didn't return home. You walked the length of the city until your legs burned. Freedom or death. You laughed quietly. You couldn't tell which one you were walking in. You stayed with the guillotine a few more months. But something had shifted. You began finishing your work too quickly. You forgot rags, left tools behind. One day, you vomited after the third drop. Then came the news. Robespierre was dead. The blade that had ended so many had turned upward. The tribunals were slowing. The list has been shortened. Grew onions, raised chickens, learned to mend shoes. The crowd stopped coming. And then, finally, one morning, there was no schedule. You arrived anyway. Out of habit, the frame stood still, damp with morning dew. You sat on your stool beside the platform, rag in hand, and waited for nothing. A bird landed on the edge of the blade, sang once, flew away. That was the moment you decided not to return. You packed your tools, burned your apron, and took only two things with you. The book Julien gave you, and the pressed flower from the execution stage. You moved to a village 2 days, ride west, tell no one your name, told them you'd worked as a carpenter. No one questioned it. You lived quietly, but sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the wind rustled through the shutters, like a crowd murmuring before a sentence, you sat with your old rag in your lap, washed and folded, and thought, there is no clean justice, only clean wood, clean steel, and the quiet hands that wiped them after. You were one of those hands. You still are, but no one will ever know. And maybe you think that's the cleanest thing you've left behind.